9. Unknown shocking facts about Native American tribes. What if I told you that everything you learned about Native American tribes in school was barely scratching the surface? What if the real story, the one buried under centuries of silence, politics, and neglect, is so shocking, so extraordinary, that it would completely change the way you see the history of this land? Today, we are going to uncover 9 facts about Native American tribes that almost nobody talks about. Some of these will make your jaw drop, some will make you angry, and some will fill you with a kind of awe that stays with you long after this story ends. So settle in, because this journey starts thousands of years ago on a piece of land that most people have never even heard of. Let us begin with the first shocking fact. Long before the Egyptian pyramids rose above the desert sands, long before the Greeks built their temples, and long before Rome was even a dream in anyone's mind, a massive city was being constructed in what is now the state of Louisiana. It is called Poverty Point, and when archaeologists first began to truly study it, they could not believe what they were looking at. This was not some small village. This was not a scattering of huts around a fire. This was a planned, engineered, monumental complex built around 1700 BCE, nearly 4,000 years ago. The earthworks at Poverty Point include enormous concentric ridges arranged in a half-circle pattern, a massive mound that rises more than 70 feet into the air, and evidence of a trade network that stretched across most of eastern North America. The people who built Poverty Point were not farmers. That is what stunned the archaeological world. They were hunter-gatherers. Every textbook, every theory, every assumption about human civilization said the same thing. You need agriculture to build cities. You need farming to create surplus. You need surplus to free up labor. You need free labor to build monuments. But the people of Poverty Point shattered that assumption completely. They built one of the most impressive ancient sites on the continent without planting a single crop. They did it through an extraordinarily efficient system of fishing, hunting, and gathering that produced enough surplus to support thousands of people and allow them to undertake construction projects that would have required millions of hours of coordinated labor. And here's the part that really gets under your skin. For decades, mainstream historians either ignored Poverty Point or downplayed its significance. It did not fit the narrative. The narrative said that the Americas before European contact were a wilderness, a vast untouched land populated by scattered, simple tribes. Poverty Point proves that this narrative was a lie from the very beginning. The people who lived on this land were building civilizations while much of Europe was still living in small tribal villages. And yet most Americans have never heard the name Poverty Point. Most Americans cannot tell you that one of the oldest engineered complexes in the Western Hemisphere sits right here, in their own country, in the bayous of northeastern Louisiana. Now, let us move to the second shocking fact. And this one takes us to a place that even fewer people know about. In the year 1050 CE, while Europe was deep in the medieval period, while kings and lords were fighting over muddy castles and small territories, a city was thriving in the heart of North America that was larger than London. It was called Cahokia, and it stood where East St. Louis, Illinois sits today. At its peak, Cahokia had a population of somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000 people. Some estimates push that number even higher. To put that in perspective, London in 1050 had roughly 15,000 inhabitants. Paris was slightly larger, but not by much. Cahokia was one of the biggest cities on Earth at that time, and it was right here in the middle of America. The city was dominated by a structure called Monk's Mound, which is the largest earthen structure in all of the Americas. It covers more ground area than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Let that sink in for a moment. A mound built by Native Americans in Illinois covers more ground than the Great Pyramid of Egypt. Cahokia had a grand central plaza, residential neighborhoods, a sophisticated drainage system, and even a wooden astronomical observatory that archaeologists have named Woodhenge, a reference to Stonehenge in England. The people of Cahokia were part of what we call the Mississippian culture, and they were brilliant urban planners. They organized their city along precise astronomical alignments. They conducted elaborate ceremonies. They traded with communities as far away as the Gulf of Mexico and the Great Lakes. And then, sometime around 1300 CE, they vanished. The city was abandoned. The people dispersed. Theories about why Cahokia collapsed range from environmental degradation to political upheaval to a devastating flood. But the truth is, we do not know for certain. What we do know is that a great American city rose, flourished, and fell centuries before Columbus ever set foot on a Caribbean beach. And the tragedy is not just that Cahokia fell. The tragedy is that its story has been almost completely erased from popular American memory. Most students go through 12 years of school and 4 years of college without ever hearing the word Cahokia. They learn about ancient Rome and ancient Greece and ancient Egypt, but they never learn that an ancient metropolis once stood along the Mississippi River, shaping the culture and economy of an entire continent. The third shocking fact takes us into the realm of government and democracy, and it challenges one of the most cherished myths in American history. Most Americans believe that the United States Constitution and the idea of democratic government were inspired primarily by ancient Greece and the philosophers of the European Enlightenment. And that is partially true. The founders did study Greek democracy and Roman republicanism. They did read Locke and Montesquieu. But there is another source of inspiration that history has largely forgotten, and it was right here on American soil. It was the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy. The Haudenosaunee were a union of 6 nations: the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, the Seneca, and later the Tuscarora, who came together under a constitution called the Great Law of Peace. And this constitution was not some vague oral tradition. It was a detailed, sophisticated system of governance that established a representative legislature, a system of checks and balances, processes for impeachment of leaders, protections for individual rights, and a federal structure that allowed each nation to maintain its sovereignty while participating in collective decision-making. The Great Law of Peace was established sometime between the 12th and 15th centuries, making it one of the oldest continuously operating democratic constitutions in the world. Benjamin Franklin knew about it. He had interacted with Haudenosaunee leaders. In 1751, Franklin wrote a letter in which he noted that if 6 nations of ignorant savages, his words, reflecting the prejudice of his time, could form such a union, it would be strange if the English colonies could not do the same. At the Albany Congress of 1754, Franklin presented his Albany Plan of Union, which bore striking similarities to the structure of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. In 1988, the United States Congress passed a resolution formally acknowledging the influence of the Iroquois Confederacy on the Constitution. Senate Concurrent Resolution 331 stated that the confederation of the original 13 colonies into one republic was influenced by the political system developed by the Iroquois Confederacy. And here's what makes this even more remarkable. The Great Law of Peace was not just a political document, it was a spiritual and ethical framework. It required leaders to consider the impact of their decisions on the next 7 generations. Imagine that. Every law, Every policy, every action had to be evaluated not just for its immediate effects, but for how it would affect people who would not be born for more than a century. This concept, often called seventh-generation thinking, is one of the most profound principles of governance ever conceived by any civilization anywhere in the world. And yet, in most American history classes, the contribution of the Haudenosaunee to American democracy is either mentioned in a single sentence or not mentioned at all. The fourth shocking fact is about language, and it reveals something about the diversity of Native American cultures that most people simply cannot comprehend. Before European contact, there were more than 300 distinct languages spoken across North America. Not dialects, not variations, completely separate languages, as different from each other as English is from Mandarin Chinese or as Arabic is from Japanese. These languages belonged to dozens of entirely different language families that had no common ancestor. To understand what that means, consider this. Almost every language spoken in Europe, English, French, Spanish, German, Russian, Greek, Hindi, belongs to a single language family called Indo-European. They all descended from a single ancestral language spoken thousands of years ago. The linguistic diversity of all of Europe fits into one family. The linguistic diversity of pre-contact North America spanned more than 60 families. The Navajo language, which belongs to the Athabascan family, is as different from the Cherokee language, which belongs to the Iroquoian family, as English is from Chinese. And the Lakota language, which belongs to the Siouan family, is as different from both of those as Swahili is from Finnish. This staggering linguistic diversity tells us something crucial about the depth of Native American history on this continent. Languages do not diversify overnight. It takes thousands upon thousands of years for a single language to split into two, and then for those two to split again and again and again until you have dozens of completely unrelated families. The linguistic evidence suggests that human beings have been living on this continent for far longer than most people realize, developing hundreds of unique civilizations, each with its own way of seeing and describing the world. And this brings us to one of the great tragedies of the modern era. Of those 300-plus languages, more than half are now extinct, gone forever. And of the languages that survive, many are spoken by fewer than 100 people, most of them elderly. When those elders die, their language dies with them. And when a language dies, it is not just words and grammar that are lost. It is an entire way of thinking, an entire framework for understanding reality, an entire library of knowledge accumulated over millennia. The Yuchi language, spoken by a small community in Oklahoma, is considered a language isolate, meaning it has no known relatives. It is the last surviving member of its family. There are fewer than 5 fluent speakers left. When they are gone, a linguistic lineage that stretches back perhaps 10,000 years or more will simply cease to exist. That is not just a loss for the Yuchi people. That is a loss for all of humanity. The fifth shocking fact takes us into the world of medicine and science, and it will change the way you think about who was really advanced and who was really primitive. When European explorers and settlers first arrived in the Americas, they brought with them a deep conviction that they were the civilized ones and that the native inhabitants were savages who had nothing to teach them. This attitude persisted for centuries, and yet the medical knowledge of many Native American tribes was, in certain respects, centuries ahead of European medicine. The Aztecs and Maya, who are often discussed in the context of Mesoamerica, but whose medical traditions influenced and were connected to tribes across North America, had developed an understanding of herbal medicine that European doctors would not match for hundreds of years. But let us focus specifically on North American tribes. The Cherokee had identified and were using over 800 different plant species for medicinal purposes. They had treatments for infections, fevers, pain, digestive disorders, respiratory illnesses, and even depression. They used willow bark as a pain reliever. The active compound in willow bark is salicin, which is the natural precursor to aspirin. Europeans did not develop aspirin until 1897. The Cherokee had been using its natural equivalent for centuries before that. The Ojibwe used a form of what we would now call sphagnum moss as a wound dressing. This moss has natural antibacterial and absorbent properties. During World War I, when European doctors were desperately searching for wound dressings, they turned to sphagnum moss, a material that Native Americans had been using for generations. Many tribes across the Great Plains and the eastern woodlands practiced forms of surgery, including the setting of broken bones, the drainage of abscesses, and even basic dental work. Some tribes practiced a form of inoculation against disease long before Edward Jenner developed the smallpox vaccine in 1796. The Haudenosaunee tribe had methods of exposing individuals to small amounts of infectious material to build resistance, a practice that parallels the basic principle of vaccination. And perhaps most remarkably, many Native American medical practitioners had a holistic understanding of health that modern Western medicine is only now beginning to embrace. They understood that physical health, mental health, spiritual well-being, and community connection were all intertwined. They did not separate the body from the mind. They did not treat symptoms in isolation. They looked at the whole person, the whole community, the whole environment. Today, concepts like mind-body medicine, integrative health, and community-based wellness are considered cutting-edge ideas in modern healthcare. Native American healers were practicing these concepts 1,000 years ago. And yet, when European colonizers encountered these medical traditions, they dismissed them as witchcraft and superstition. Healers were persecuted, knowledge was suppressed, traditions were driven underground. Centuries of accumulated medical wisdom were nearly destroyed, not because they were wrong, but because the people who held them were seen as less than human.
The sixth shocking fact involves agriculture, and it is one of the most important and least known stories in the history of food. Approximately 60% of the crops grown in the world today were originally developed by Native American peoples. Let me say that again, because it is one of those facts that is so enormous it almost does not register the first time you hear it. 60% of the world's crops, corn, potatoes, tomatoes, beans, squash, peppers, peanuts, chocolate, vanilla, avocados, sunflowers, tobacco, cotton, rubber. All of these were developed by indigenous peoples of the Americas through centuries and sometimes millennia of careful selective breeding and agricultural innovation. Corn alone is perhaps the greatest feat of genetic engineering in human history. The ancestor of modern corn is a wild grass called teosinte. If you saw teosinte growing in a field, you would never in a million years guess that it was related to the tall, heavy-eared corn plant that feeds billions of people today. Teosinte has tiny seed heads with only a handful of hard, nearly inedible kernels. The transformation of teosinte into corn required thousands of years of deliberate selective breeding by indigenous farmers in Mesoamerica, a process so sophisticated that modern geneticists have described it as one of the most remarkable accomplishments in the entire history of biology. And it was not just about developing the crops. Native American farmers created entire agricultural systems that were sustainable, productive, and ecologically sound. The most famous of these is the Three Sisters system used by tribes across North America. In this system, corn, beans, and squash are planted together in the same mound. The corn provides a tall stalk for the beans to climb. The beans fix nitrogen in the soil, providing natural fertilizer for the corn and squash. And the squash spreads its broad leaves across the ground, suppressing weeds and retaining soil moisture. It is an elegant, self-sustaining system that produces high yields without chemical fertilizers, without pesticides, and without depleting the soil. Modern sustainable agriculture experts look at the Three Sisters system and marvel at its efficiency. It is a perfect example of polyculture, a farming method that mimics natural ecosystems and is increasingly recognized as superior to the monoculture practices that dominate modern industrial farming. Here's what makes this fact truly shocking. When Europeans arrived, they found a land that was not wild and untouched. It was a land that had been carefully managed, cultivated, and shaped by human hands for thousands of years. The forests of eastern North America were not untamed wilderness. They were managed landscapes, regularly burned by Native Americans to clear underbrush, promote the growth of useful plants, attract game animals, and maintain ecological balance. The Great Plains were not an empty grassland. They were a carefully managed ecosystem in which Native Americans used controlled burns to maintain the health of the grasslands and support the massive buffalo herds on which their economies depended. The Amazon rainforest, which extends the story beyond North America but is deeply relevant, contains vast areas of terra preta, artificially enriched soil created by indigenous peoples over thousands of years of careful land management. The idea that Europeans arrived in a pristine wilderness is one of the most persistent and damaging myths in history. They arrived in a garden, a continent-sized garden that had been tended by hundreds of different peoples for thousands of years. And then, through disease, warfare, and forced removal, the gardeners were killed or driven away. And within a few generations, the garden grew wild, and the newcomers looked at the overgrown landscape and said, "Look at this wilderness. It has always been like this."